June 6, 1944. Just after dawn, the waters of the English Channel are alive with sound and motion. The low rumble of engines mixes with the crash of waves against steel hulls. On the horizon, a vast armada stretches as far as the eye can see, over 5,000 ships, the largest invasion fleet in human history. Destroyers and battleships loom like floating fortresses, while small landing craft bob and sway, crammed with soldiers who know the next hour may be their last. More than 56,000 Allied troops are about to attempt the impossible, storming the heavily fortified coast of Normandy, France, and opening the gateway to Europe. Behind them, 11,000 aircraft roar overhead, ready to unleash bombs and paratroopers into the darkened skies of occupied France. The sheer scale is staggering. One American officer would later write, "It seemed as though the very sea itself was moving toward France." But this moment was years in the making. Hitler's armies had occupied Europe for nearly 5 years. London had endured the Blitz. The Soviet Union had lost millions on the Eastern Front. And though the Allies had pushed the Nazis out of North Africa and landed in Italy, Western Europe remained firmly under German control. For the war to be won, the Allies needed to return to France. There would be no easy way. Only a massive assault could break Hitler's grip. For many of the young men waiting on those landing craft, the words offered some comfort. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Manchester, fishermen from Nova Scotia, ordinary people about to be swept into extraordinary history. Some clutched rosaries, others pictures of sweethearts or families back home. As the shoreline grew larger, so did the pounding in their hearts. Few had seen combat before. All knew that the Germans were waiting with machine guns, artillery, and miles of barbed wire. To understand why the Allies risked everything on June 6, 1944, we must look back at the road that led them to Normandy. By the spring of that year, Nazi Germany had occupied most of Europe for nearly 5 years. France had fallen in 1940, its people living under occupation. Norway, the Low Countries, Poland, and much of Eastern Europe were under Hitler's control. Britain stood defiant, scarred but unbroken after surviving the Blitz, while the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting in the East, losing millions of soldiers and civilians as German armies pushed deep into their territory. For years, Joseph Stalin demanded that Britain and America open a second front in Western Europe to relieve the crushing pressure on the Soviet Union. By 1944, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt agreed that time was running out. If the Red Army continued to push westward without Allied intervention, the Soviet Union might control all of Europe after the war. An invasion of France was no longer just a military necessity. It was also a political one, to ensure that the map of post-war Europe did not belong entirely to Stalin. But where should the Allies strike? The Germans expected an invasion at the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point from Britain to France. To exploit this expectation, the Allies launched one of the greatest deception operations in history, Operation Bodyguard. Entire phantom armies were created on the English coast. Inflatable tanks were deployed in fields, dummy landing craft were parked along harbors, and fake radio traffic was generated to convince German intelligence that the invasion would come at Calais. Even General George S. Patton, one of the Allies' most feared commanders, was placed in charge of this imaginary army to sell the illusion. The deception worked. Hitler and his generals remained convinced for weeks that Normandy was merely a diversion, holding back key panzer divisions far from the real beaches. This miscalculation would prove critical when the landings finally began. Meanwhile, Allied planners pored over maps, tide charts, and weather reports. The beaches of Normandy were not the obvious choice. Strong currents, shifting sands, and towering cliffs posed serious challenges. But Normandy also offered key advantages. It was lightly defended compared to Calais. It was within range of Allied aircraft from Britain, and it provided access to the ports of Cherbourg and Le Havre once secured. After months of debate, Normandy was chosen as the point of attack. The invasion was codenamed Operation Overlord, with the amphibious assault itself known as Operation Neptune. It would involve not only soldiers and sailors, but engineers, doctors, meteorologists, and thousands of support staff. Every detail mattered, from waterproofing vehicles to inventing new kinds of landing craft that could deliver tanks directly onto the sand. The operation required a level of coordination between nations, services, and industries that had never been attempted before. By the spring of 1944, Britain had become a vast armed camp. American GIs filled villages and towns across southern England. Airfields buzzed with activity, and roads were jammed with tanks and trucks hidden under camouflage netting. Civilians watched as their quiet countryside was transformed into the staging ground for the greatest invasion in history. Everything was now set. The only question that remained was when to strike. The responsibility for the invasion rested on the shoulders of one man, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, he carried the weight of the hopes of millions. Eisenhower was calm, approachable, and steady under pressure, qualities that made him the right leader for such a task. His challenge was enormous: to coordinate American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces, each with their own traditions, rivalries, and commanders, into one unified strike against Hitler's Fortress Europe. The plan itself was daring. The Allies would launch an amphibious assault across the English Channel, the most heavily defended stretch of coastline in the world. To succeed, every branch of the military army, navy, and air force had to work together in perfect synchronization. Timing would be everything. The landings required the right combination of moonlight, tides, and weather. A miscalculation could leave soldiers stranded on the beaches or smashed against the rocks by waves before they even reached enemy fire. As June approached, meteorologists delivered grim news. A fierce Atlantic storm threatened to wreck the operation. Originally scheduled for June 5th, the invasion was postponed. Troops remained packed inside their ships and landing craft, seasick and restless as waves battered the channel. Eisenhower consulted his weather experts again. They predicted a brief break in the storm on June 6th. It was not ideal, but it might be the only chance before bad weather returned for weeks. The decision could not wait. On the evening of June 4th, Eisenhower gathered his commanders in a small room in Portsmouth. Tension hung thick in the air. Some urged caution. Others feared delay would ruin morale and secrecy. After listening quietly, Eisenhower looked around the table and finally spoke. "Okay," he said simply, "let's go." With those words, the largest invasion in history was set in motion. Thousands of ships began to move out of British harbors and head toward France under the cover of darkness. The weight of that decision was so heavy that Eisenhower secretly prepared a message to be delivered if the invasion failed. In it, he took full responsibility, writing that, "If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He folded the note and placed it in his pocket. It would remain unseen until after the war, a silent reminder of the immense gamble he was taking. Victory was not guaranteed. Defeat could mean disaster. Even Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, feared the worst. He told colleagues, "I am hardening myself to the possibility that it may well be the most terrible disaster of the whole war." Memories of World War I haunted him, the slaughter at Gallipoli, where thousands died in a failed amphibious assault. Normandy could end the same way. Yet Churchill also knew that without this invasion, Europe might never be liberated. The risk had to be taken, whatever the cost. As night fell on June 5th, convoys of ships pushed out into the Channel. In the skies above, thousands of planes prepared to launch airborne divisions into France. Eisenhower visited the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne before they departed. He spoke casually with them, asked questions about their hometowns, and tried to steady their nerves. A famous photograph captures him gesturing with his hands as soldiers grinned nervously around him. In just a few hours, those men would leap into darkness and into history. Long before the first landing craft reached the beaches, the invasion began in the skies. In the early hours of June 6th, more than 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with thousands of British and Canadian airborne troops, prepared to leap into the darkness over occupied France. Their mission was critical: seize bridges, destroy road junctions, and block German reinforcements from rushing toward the beaches once the invasion began. The men were loaded with more than 80 pounds of equipment: rifles, grenades, radios, rations, even inflatable life vests in case they landed in water. Many carried extra ammunition strapped to their legs, making it difficult to even climb aboard the planes. As the aircraft engines roared to life, the paratroopers sat in silence, the hum of the propellers mixing with their own thoughts. Some chewed gum nervously, others scribbled quick notes to loved ones they might never see again. At just after midnight, hundreds of transport planes lifted off from airfields across southern England. The night sky was filled with a continuous stream of aircraft, each carrying a stick of paratroopers ready to jump. Pilots flew through heavy clouds and intense German anti-aircraft fire. Flak shells burst around them, rocking the planes violently. Inside, men clutched their parachute cords and prayed that the green light would come on, that signal to jump into the unknown. When the light finally flashed, the paratroopers hurled themselves into the night. Chutes snapped open above fields and villages, but many were scattered miles from their intended drop zones. Strong winds, poor visibility, and enemy fire sent units sprawling across the countryside. Some landed in swamps and rivers, drowning under the weight of their gear. Others came down in trees or directly into German positions, forced to fight the moment their boots hit the ground. Despite the chaos, small groups of airborne soldiers improvised. They gathered whoever they could find and pressed forward with their missions. In the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, American paratroopers fought house to house, securing one of the first villages liberated in France. One paratrooper, Private John Steele, became famous when his parachute caught on the church steeple. Dangling helplessly as the battle raged below, he played dead until the Germans cut him down and took him prisoner. He later escaped to rejoin his unit. Elsewhere, British airborne troops captured vital bridges over the River Orne, holding them against counterattacks until reinforcements arrived. Canadian paratroopers cut German supply lines and created confusion across the countryside. Though scattered and often outnumbered, the airborne divisions accomplished enough of their objectives to sow chaos among the German defenders, buying precious hours for the men who would soon be storming the beaches. In addition to the paratroopers, thousands of soldiers arrived by glider. These fragile wooden aircraft, towed by larger planes, carried heavy equipment such as jeeps and small artillery pieces. Landing in rough fields under enemy fire, many crashed violently, but their crews still fought on. The airborne assault was costly, with thousands of casualties, but it succeeded in its purpose. By dawn, the Germans were in disarray, their communication lines cut and their reserves delayed. The stage was set for the main invasion to begin. For the men who had jumped into the darkness, the night was one of terror, confusion, and heroism. Scattered though they were, their courage ensured that the troops landing on the beaches at dawn would not face the full force of German reinforcements. The airborne divisions had taken their place in history as the vanguard of D-Day, the first to risk everything for the chance to liberate Europe. At 6:30 in the morning, on June 6th, the naval bombardment lifted, and the first landing craft began to drop their ramps. In front of them were 5 landing zones, each given a code name: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Golden Sword for the British, and Juno for the Canadians. Each would test the courage of the men who charged ashore, and each would write its own chapter in the story of D-Day. At Utah Beach, strong currents pushed many of the landing craft nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zone. What might have been disaster turned into fortune. The new sector was less heavily defended, and the Americans were able to push inland with fewer losses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, famously led the way despite walking with a cane. When he realized the mistaken landing, he calmly declared, "We'll start the war from right here." His leadership steadied the troops, and Utah became the most successful of the American beaches. Omaha Beach was a nightmare. The Germans had fortified the cliffs and bluffs with bunkers, barbed wire, and interlocking fields of fire. As the ramps dropped, machine guns tore into the ranks of the first waves. Explosions from mines and artillery churned the surf red with blood. Many soldiers drowned under the weight of their packs before they could even reach the sand. By mid-morning, chaos reigned. Units were scattered, pinned down, and in some sectors, annihilated. Casualties soared above 2,000 in just a few hours, making Omaha the costliest of the 5 landings. Amid the carnage, acts of heroism turned the tide. Engineers cleared obstacles under fire, creating narrow lanes through which tanks and reinforcements could advance. Small groups of men, often led by junior officers or even sergeants, crawled up the bluffs, tossing grenades into machine gun nests and silencing German positions one by one. Brigadier General Norman Cota, waiting ashore under fire, rallied demoralized troops with the cry, "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beaches. Let us go inland and be killed." Slowly, painfully, the Americans broke through. By evening, Omaha was secured, though at a terrible cost. To the east, British forces stormed Gold and Sword beaches. They faced minefields, artillery, and determined German defenders, but also brought with them an arsenal of ingenious armored vehicles nicknamed Hobart's Funnies. These modified tanks carried flamethrowers, bridge-laying gear, and rotating flails to clear mines. With their help, British troops overcame obstacles and pushed inland, capturing key villages and knocking out coastal batteries. The Canadians at Juno Beach endured one of the fiercest defenses of the day. Their landing craft struck mines, and enemy fire swept the shore. Casualties in the first waves rivaled those at Omaha. Yet the Canadians fought with relentless determination, pressing forward until they had advanced further inland than any other Allied force that day. By nightfall, they had linked up with British units and established a secure foothold in Normandy. Naval gunfire and air support played vital roles throughout the day. Warships pounded German defenses, sometimes so close to shore that they risked running aground. Allied aircraft strafed and bombed strongpoints, though low clouds limited their effectiveness in the morning. Still, the combination of sea, air, and sheer human determination wore down the German defenses. By the evening of June 6th, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands. The cost had been staggering, more than 10,000 Allied casualties, including over 4,000 dead. German losses were also severe, though exact numbers remain uncertain. Yet against all odds, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. What began as a desperate gamble had succeeded. The door to Europe was open. Thank you for watching. Share this video if you'd like more people to remember the sacrifices of D-Day, and subscribe for more history brought to life.